Right, this is chapter 12 of The Hiding Place by Corrie Vaught. Get your things together. Get ready to evacuate. Collect all possessions and pillowcases. The shouts of the guards echoed up and down the long corridor. I stood in the center of my cell in a frenzy of excitement. Evacuate? Then something was happening. We were leaving the prison. The counter-invasion must have begun. I snatched the pillowcase from the little wad of straw I had stuffed into it. What riches this coarse bit of muslin had been in the 2 weeks since it had been provided. A shield for my head from the scratch and the smell of bedding. It almost didn't matter that the promised sheets had never arrived. With trembling hands, I dropped my few belongings into it. The blue sweater, the pajamas, covered now back and front with embroidered figures, toothbrush, comb, a few remaining crackers wrapped in toilet paper. My Bible was in its pouch on my back where it remained, except when I was reading it. I put on my coat and hat and stood at the iron door, clutching the pillowcase in both hands. It was still early in the morning. The tin breakfast plate had not yet been removed from the shelf in the door. Getting ready had taken no time at all. An hour passed. I sat on the cot. 2 hours. 3. It was warm in the cell this late June day. I took off my hat and coat and folded them next to me on the cot. More time passed. I kept my eyes on the anthole, hoping for a last visit from my small friends, but they did not appear. Probably I had frightened them by my early dashing about. I reached into the pillowcase, took out one of the crackers, and crumbled it into the little crack. No ants. They were staying safely hidden. And suddenly I realized that this, too, was a message, a last wordless communication among neighbors. For I, too, had a hiding place when things were bad. Jesus was this place, the rock cleft for me. I pressed a finger into the tiny crevice. The afternoon sun appeared on the wall and moved slowly across the cell, and then all at once there was a clanging on the corridor. Doors scraped, bolts banged. Out! Schnell! All out! No talking! I snatched up my hat and coat. My door screeched open. Form ranks of 5. The guard was already at the next cell. I stepped out into the hall. It was jammed from wall to wall. I had never dreamed so many women occupied this corridor. We exchanged looks. Invasion, we mouthed silently, the soundless words sweeping through the massed women like an electric charge. Surely the invasion of Holland had begun. Why else would they be emptying the prison? Where would we be taken? Where would we be headed? Not into Germany, dear Jesus, not Germany. The command was given, and we shuffled forward down the long, chill halls, each carrying a pillowcase with her belongings forming a little bulge at the bottom. At last we emerged into the wide courtyard inside the front gate of the prison, and another long wait began. But this wait was pleasant with the light afternoon sun on our backs. Far to the right I could see the columns of men's sections, but crane my neck as I would, I could not see Betsy anywhere. At last the huge gate swung in, and a convoy of gray transport buses drove through. I was herded aboard the third one. The seats had been removed, the windows painted over. The buses lurched dreadfully as it started up, but we were standing too close together to fall. When the bus ground to a stop, we were at a freight yard somewhere in the outskirts of the city. Again, we were formed into ranks. The guards' voices were tense and shrill. We had to keep our heads facing forward, eyes front. Behind us, we could hear buses arriving, then lumbering away. It was still light, but I knew by the ache in my stomach that it was long past supper time. And then, ahead and to the left of me, in the newest group of arriving prisoners, I spotted a chestnut bun. Somehow, some way, I was going to get to her. Now, instead of wanting the day to end, I prayed that we stay where we were until dark. Slowly, the long June day faded. Thunder rumbled, and a few drops of rain fell. At last, a long row of unlit coaches rolled slowly over the tracks in front of us. They banged to a stop, rolled forward a little further, then stopped again. After a while, they began backing. For an hour or more, the train switched back and forth. By the time the order came to board, it was pitch dark. The ranks of prisoners surged forward. Behind us, the guards shouted and cursed. Obviously, they were nervous at transporting so many prisoners at one time. I wriggled and shoved to the left. Elbows and shoulders were in my way, but I squirmed past. At the very steps of the train, I reached out and seized Betsy's hand. Together we climbed onto the train. Together we found seats in a crowded compartment. Together we wept tears of gratitude. The 4 months in Schweinstein had been our first separation in 53 years. It seemed to me that I could bear whatever happened with Betsy beside me. More hours passed as the loaded train sat on the siding. For us they flew. There was so much to share. Betsy told me about each of her cellmates, and I told her about mine and the little hole into which they scrambled at any emergency. As always, Betsy had given to the others everything she had. The Bible that Nolly had smuggled to her she had torn up and passed around book by book. It must have been 2 or 3 in the morning that the train at last began to move. We pressed our faces to the glass, but no light showed and clouds covered the moon. The thought uppermost in every mind was, is it Germany? At one point we made out a tower that Betsy was sure was the cathedral at Delft. An hour or more later, the clack of the train changed pitch. We were crossing a trestle, but a very long one. As the minutes passed and still we had not reached the other side, Betsy and I exchanged looks. The Mordigix Bridge, we were headed south, not east into Germany, but south into Brabant. For the second time that night, we wept tears of joy. I leaned my head back against the wooden slats of the seat and shut my eyes, reliving another train trip to Brabant. Mamma's hand had gripped Father's, then as the train swayed. Then, too, it was June, the June of the first sermon, the garden back of the manse, of Carol. I must have fallen asleep. Back in that other June, for when I opened my eyes, the train had stopped. Voices were shouting us to move. Schneller, aber schnell! An eerie glare lit the windows. Betsy and I stumbled after the others along the aisle and down the iron steps. We seemed to have stopped in the middle of the woods. Floodlights mounted and trees lit a broad, rough-cleared path lined by soldiers with leveled guns. Spurred by the shouts of the guards, Betsy and I started up the path between the gun barrels. Schneller! Close ranks! Keep up! 5 abreast! Betsy's breath was coming short and hard, and still they yelled at us to go faster. It had rained hard here, for there were deep puddles in the path. Ahead of us, a white-haired woman stepped to the side to avoid one. A soldier struck her in the back with a gun butt. It took Betsy's pillowcase and hung with mine, hooked on my other arm through hers, and hauled her along beside me. The nightmare march lasted a mile or more. At last we came to a barbed wire fence surrounding a row of wooden barracks. There were no beds in the one we entered, only long tables with backless benches pulled up to them. Betsy and I collapsed onto one of these. Under my arm I could feel the irregular flutter of her heart. We fell into an exhausted sleep, our heads on the table. The sun was streaming through the barracks windows when we woke up. We were thirsty and hungry. We had had nothing to eat or drink since the early meal at Chavagnine the morning before. But all that day no guard or any official person appeared inside the barracks. At last, when the sun was low in the sky, a prisoner crew arrived with a great vat of some thick, steamy substance that we gobbled ravenously. And so began our stay in this place that we learned was named Vaught, after the nearest small village. Unlike Chavagnine, which had been a regular Dutch prison, Vaught had been constructed by the occupation, especially as a concentration camp for political prisoners. We were not yet in the camp proper, but in a kind of quarantine compound outside. Our biggest problem was idleness, wedged together as we were along the long rows of tables with nothing to do. We were guarded by the same young women who had patrolled the corridors at Chavagnine. They had been adequate enough as long as we were behind locked doors. Here they seemed at a loss. Their only technique for maintaining discipline was to shriek obscenities and hand out punishments to all alike. Half rations for the entire barracks, an extra roll call at rigid attention, a ban on talking for 24 hours. Only one of our overseers never threatened or raised her voice. This was the tall, silent head matron from Chavagnine. She appeared in Vaught the 3rd morning during the pre-dawn roll call, and at once something like order seized our rebellious and untidied ranks. Lines straightened, hands were clamped to sides, whispers ceased as those cold blue eyes swept across us. Among ourselves, we nicknamed her the General. During one long roll call, a pregnant woman at our table slumped to the floor, striking her head against the edge of a bench. The General did not so much as pause at her expressionless reading of names. We had been in this outer camp at Vaught almost 2 weeks when Betsy and I, along with a dozen others, were called out by name during morning roll call. When the rest had been dismissed, the General distributed typewritten forms among us and instructed us to present them at the administration barracks at 9 o'clock. A worker on the food crew, a long-term prisoner from the main camp, smiled encouragingly as he ladled out our breakfast. "You're free," he whispered. "Those pink forms mean release." Betsy and I stared disbelievingly at the sheets of paper in our hands. Free? Free to leave, free to go home. Others crowded around, congratulating us, embracing us. The women from Betsy's cell at Chevine 9 wept unabashedly. How cruel to leave all these behind. Surely the war will be over soon, we told them. We emptied our pillowcases, passing out our few belongings among those who had to stay. Long before 9 o'clock, we were standing in the big wooden anteroom of administration. At last, we were summoned into an inner office where our forms were examined, stamped, and handed over to a guard. We followed this man down a corridor into another office. For hours, the process continued as we were shuttled from one room and official to another, questioned, fingerprinted, sent on to the next post. The group of prisoners grew until there were 40 or 50 of us standing in line beside a high anchor chain fence topped with barbed wire. On the other side of the fence was a white birch woods. Above our heads, the blue Brabant sky. We, too, belonged to that wide, free world. The next barracks we entered held a row of desks with women clerks seated behind them. At one of these, I was handed a brown paper envelope. I emptied it into my hand and watched, and the next moment was staring in disbelief at my Alpina watch, Mama's rings, even my paper guilders. I had not seen these things since the night we had arrived in Chevine 9. Money. Why, that belonged to the world of shops and trolley cars. We could go to a train station with this money. 2 fares to Harlem, please. We marched along a path between twisted rolls of barbed wire and through a wide gate into a compound of low tin roof barracks. There were more lines, more waits, more shuffling from desk to desk, but already the camp and its procedures had become unreal to me. Then we were standing before a high counter, and a young male clerk was saying, "Leave all personal effects at the window marked C." But they just gave them back to me! Watches, purses, jewelry. Mechanically, like a machine with no will of its own, I handed watch, ring, and money through the small barred window. A uniformed woman swept them into a metal box. "Move along, next!" Then, were we not to be released? Outside this building, a florid-faced officer formed us into double column and marched us across a broad parade ground. At one end of it, a crew of men with shaved heads and striped overalls were digging a ditch. What did it mean? What did any of it mean? This whole long day of lines and waits. Betsy's face was gray with weariness, and she stumbled as we marched. Through another fence, we arrived in a yard surrounded on 3 sides by low concrete buildings. A young woman in a military cape was waiting for us. "Prisoners, halt!" barked the red-faced officer. "Explain to the newcomers, Fräulein, the function of the bunkers." "The bunkers," the girl began in the bored voice of a museum guide, "are for the accommodation of those who fail to cooperate with camp rules. The rooms are cozy, if a bit small, about the size of a gym locker. To hasten the educational process, the hands are tied above the head." Even as the horrid recital continued, 2 guards came out of the bunkers, carrying between them the form of a man. He was alive, for his legs were moving, but he seemed to have no conscious control over them. His eyes were sunken and rolled back in his head. "Not everyone," the girl observed in the same detached drawl, "seems to appreciate the accommodations at the bunkers." I seized Betsy's arm as the command to march came again, more to steady myself than her. It was father's train case once ahead. Such cruelty was too much to grasp, too much to bear. Heavenly Father, carry it for me. We followed the officer down a wide street lined with barracks on either side and halted at one of the gray, featureless sheds. It was the end of a long day of standing, waiting, hoping. We had simply arrived in the main camp at Vaught. The barracks appeared almost identical to the ones we had left this morning, except that this one was furnished with bunks as well as tables and benches. And still we were not allowed to sit. There was a last wait while the matron with maddening deliberateness checked off our documents against a list. "Betsy," I wailed, "how long will this take?" "Perhaps a long, long time, perhaps many years. But what better way could there be to spend our lives?" I turned to stare at her. "What are you talking about?" "These young women. That girl back at the bunkers. Corrie, if people can be taught to hate, then they can be taught to love. We must find the way, you and I, no matter how long it takes." She went on, almost forgetting in her excitement to keep her voice a whisper, while I slowly took in the fact that she was talking about our guards. I glanced at the matron seated at the desk ahead of us. I saw a gray uniform and a visored hat. Betsy saw a wounded human being. And I wondered, not for the first time, what sort of a person she was. The sister of mine. What kind of road she followed while I trudged beside her on the all-too-solid earth. A few days later, Betsy and I were called up for work assignments. One glance at Betsy's pallid face and fragile form, and the matron waved her contemptuously back inside the barracks, where the elderly and infirm spent the day sewing prison uniforms. The women's uniforms here at Vaught was a blue overall with a red stripe down the side of the leg, practical and comfortable, and a welcome change after our own clothes that we had worn since the day of our arrest. Apparently I looked strong enough for harder work. I was told to report to the Phillips factory. This factory turned out to be no more than another large barracks inside the camp complex. Early in the morning, though it was, the tar beneath the shingled roof was beginning to bubble in the hot July sun. I followed my escort into the single large room where several hundred men and women sat at long plank tables covered with thousands of tiny radio parts. 2 officers, 1 male, 1 female, were strolling the aisles between the benches while the prisoners bent to their tasks. I was assigned to a seat at a bench near the front and given the job of measuring small glass rods and arranging them in piles according to lengths. It was monotonous work. The heat from the roof pressed like a weight on my head. I longed to exchange at least names and hometowns with my neighbors on either side, but the only sound in the room was the clink of metal parts and the squeak of officers' boots. They reached the door across from where I sat. "Production was up again last week," the male officer said in German to a tall, slender man with a shaved head and striped uniform. "You are to be commended for this increase. However, we continue to receive complaints of defective wiring. Quality control must improve." The shaved-headed man made an apologetic gesture. "If there were more food, officer," he murmured. "Since the cutback and rations, I see a difference. They grow sleepy. They have trouble concentrating." His voice reminded me a little of Willem's, deep, cultivated, the German with only a trace of Dutch accent. "Then you must wake them up. Make them concentrate on the penalties. If the soldiers on the front can fight on half rations, then these lazy—" A terrible look from the woman officer. He stopped and ran his tongue over his lips. That is, I speak of course merely as an example. There is naturally no truth to the rumor that the rations at the front are reduced. So, I hold you responsible." And together they stalked from the building. For a moment, the prisoner foreman watched them from the doorway. Slowly he raised his left hand, then dropped it with a slap to his side. The quiet room exploded. From under tables appeared writing paper, books, knitting, yarn, tins of biscuits. People left their benches and joined little knots of chattering friends all over the room. 6 crowded around me. Who was I? Where was I from? Did I have any news of the war? After perhaps half an hour of visiting among the tables, the foreman reminded us that we had a day's quota to meet, and people drifted back to their places. The foreman's name, I learned, was Mormon, and he had been the headmaster of a Roman Catholic boys' school. He himself came over to my workbench the 3rd day I was there. He had heard that I had followed the entire assembly line through the barracks, tracing what became of my dull little piles of rods. "You're the first woman worker," he said, "who has ever shown any interest in what we're making here." "I'm very interested," I said. "I'm a watchmaker." He stared at me with new interest. "Then I have work you will enjoy more." He took me to the opposite end of the huge shed where the final assembly of relay switches was done. It was intricate and exacting work, though not nearly so hard as watch repair, and Mr. Mormon was right. I enjoyed it, and it helped make the 11-hour workday go faster. Not only to me, but to all the Phillips workers, Mr. Mormon acted more as a kindly older brother than a crew boss. I would watch him, ceaselessly moving among his hundreds of charges, counseling, encouraging, finding a simpler job for the weary, a harder one for the restless. We had been at Vaught more than a month before I learned that his 20-year-old son had been shot here in the camp the week Betsy and I arrived. No trace of this personal tragedy showed in his care for the rest of us. He stopped frequently at my bench the first weeks, more to check my frame of mind than my work, but eventually his eyes would travel to the row of relay switches in front of me. "Dear watch lady, can you not remember for whom you are working? These radios are for their fighter planes." And reaching across me, he would yank a wire from its housing or twist a tiny tube from an assembly. "Now solder them back wrong, and not so fast. You're over the day's quota, and it's not yet noon." Lunchtime would have been the best time of day if I could have spent it with Betsy. However, Phillips workers were not allowed to leave the factory compound until the workday ended at 6 o'clock. Prisoners on kitchen detail lugged in great buckets of gruel made of wheat and peas, tasteless but nourishing. Apparently there had been a cutback in rations recently. Still, the food was better and more plentiful than that at Schweinstein, where there had been no noonday meal at all. After eating, we were free for blessed half-hour to stroll about within the Phillips compound in the fresh air and the glorious Brabant sun. Most days I found a spot along the fence and stretched out on the warm ground asleep. The day started with roll call at 5 a.m. Sweet summer smells came in the breezes from the farms around the camp. Sometimes I could dream that Carol and I were walking hand in hand along a country lane. At 6 o'clock in the evening there was another roll call. Then we marched back to our various sleeping barracks. Betsy always stood in the doorway of ours, waiting for me. Each evening it was as though a week had passed. There was so much to tell each other. That Belgian boy and girl at the bench next to mine, this noon they became engaged. Mrs. Hirnma, whose granddaughter was taken to Germany, today she let me pray with her. One day Betsy's news touched us directly. A lady from Ermelo was transferred to the sewing detail today. When I introduced myself, she said, "Another one?" What did she mean? "Corrie, do you remember the day we were arrested? A man came to the shop. You were sick, and I had to wake you up." I remembered very well. Remembered the strange, roving eyes, the uneasiness in the pit of my stomach. And that was more than a fever. Apparently, everyone in Ermelo knew him. He worked with the Gestapo from the first day of occupation. He reported this woman's two brothers for resistance work, and finally herself and her husband too. When Ermelo had finally caught on to him that he had come to Haarlem and teamed up with Wilmes and Capitan. His name was Jean Vogel. Flames of fire seemed to leap around that name in my heart. I thought of Father's final hours alone and confused in a hospital corridor, of the underground work so abruptly halted. I thought of Mary Ateli, arrested while walking down the street, and I knew that if Jan Vogel stood in front of me now, I could kill him. Betsy drew the little cloth bag from beneath her overalls and held it out to me, but I shook my head. Betsy kept the Bible during the day, since she had more chance to read and teach from it here than I did in the Phillips barracks. In the evenings, we held a clandestine prayer meeting for as many as could crowd around our bunk. "You lead prayers tonight, Betsy. I have a headache." More than a headache. All of me ached with the violence of my feelings about the man who had done us so much harm. That night I did not sleep, and the next day at my bench scarcely heard the conversation around me. By the end of the week I had worked myself into such a sickness of body and spirit that Mr. Mormon stopped at my bench to ask if something was wrong. Wrong? Yes, something's wrong, and I plunged into an account of that morning. I was only too eager to tell Mr. Mormon and all Holland how John Vogel had betrayed his country. What puzzled me all this time was Betsy. She had suffered everything I had, and yet she seemed to carry no burden of rage. "Betsy," I hissed one dark night when I knew that my restless tossing must be keeping her awake. 3 of us now shared the single cot as the crowded camp daily received new arrivals. "Betsy, don't you feel anything about Jean Vogel? Doesn't it bother you?" "Oh, yes, Corrie, terribly. I've felt for him ever since I knew. I pray for him whenever his name comes into my mind. How dreadfully he must be suffering." For a long time I lay silent in the huge, shadowy barracks, restless with sighs, snores, and stirrings of hundreds of women. Once again I had the feelings that the sister with whom I had spent all my life belonged somehow to another order of beings. Wasn't she telling me in her gentle way that I was as guilty as John Vogel? Didn't he and I stand together before an all-seeing God, convicted of the same sin of murder? For I had murdered him with my heart and with my tongue. "Lord Jesus," I whispered into the lumpy ticking of the bed, "I forgive Jean Vogel, as I pray that you will forgive me. I have done him great damage. Bless him now and his family." That night, for the first time since our betrayer had a name, I slept deep and dreamlessly until the whistle summoned us to roll call. The nights in Vaught were a baffling mixture of good and bad. Morning roll call was often cruelly long. If the smallest rule had been broken, such as a single prisoner late for an evening check-in, the entire barracks would be punished by a 4 a.m. or even a 3:30 call and made to stand at parade attention until our backs ached and our legs cramped. But the summer air was warm and alive with birds as the day approached. Gradually, in the east, a pink and gold sunrise would light the immense Brabant sky as Betsy and I squeezed each other's hands in awe. At 5:30 we had black bread and coffee, bitter and hot, then fell into our marching columns for the various work details. I looked forward to this hike to the Phillips factory. Part of the way we walked beside a small wood separated only by a row of barbed wire from a glistening world of dewdrops. We also marched past a section of the men's camp. many of our group straining to identify a husband or son among the ranks of shaved heads and striped overalls. This was another of the paradoxes of Vaught. I was endlessly, daily grateful to be again with people. But what I had not realized in solitary confinement was that to have companions meant to have their griefs as well. We all suffered with the women whose men were in this camp. The discipline in the male section was much harsher than in the women's. Executions were frequent. Almost every day a salvo of shots would end in anguished whispers flying. How many this time? Who were they? The woman next to me on the relay bench was an intense communist woman named Fleur. She and her husband had managed to get their 2 small children to friends before their arrest, but she worried aloud all the day about them and about Mr. Fleur, who had tuberculosis. He worked on the rope-making crew in the compound next to Philip's, and each noon they managed to exchange a few words through the barbed wire separating the 2 enclosures. Although she was expecting a 3rd child in September, she would never eat her morning allotment of bread, but passed it through the fence to him. She was dangerously thin, I felt, for an expectant mother, and several times I brought her a portion of my own breakfast bread, but this too was always set aside for Mr. Fleur. And yet, in spite of sorrow and anxiety, no one in that place was without both. There was laughter, too, in Philip's barracks, an impersonation of the pompous, blustering 2nd lieutenant, a game of blind man's bluff, and song passed around in rounds from bench to bench until, "Thick clouds! Thick the clouds!" The signal might come from any bench which faced a window. The factory barracks was set in the center of the broad Phillips compound. There was no way a camp official could approach it without crossing this open space. In an instant, every bench would be filled, the only sound the business-like rattle of radio parts. One morning, the code words were still being relayed down the long shed when a rather hefty "Awesome Herren" stepped through the door. She glanced furiously about, face flushing scarlet as she applied thick clouds to her appearance. She shrieked and ranted for a quarter of an hour, then deprived us of our noontime break in the open air that day. After this, we adopted a more neutral sign, 15. I've assembled 15 dials! During the long, hot afternoons, pranks and talk died down as each one sat alone with his own thoughts. I scratched on the side of the table the number of days until September 1st. There was nothing official about this date, just a chance remark by Mrs. Fleur to the effect that 6 months was the usual prison term for ration card offenders. Then, if that were the charge, and if they included the served time and should combine 9, September 1st would be our release date. Corrie, Betsy warned one evening when I announced triumphantly that August was half over, we don't know for sure. I had the feeling, almost, that to Betsy it didn't matter. I looked at her, sitting on our cot in the last moments before lights out, sewing up a split seam in my overalls as she'd so often sat mending under our lamplight in the dining room. Betsy, by the very way she sat, evoked a high-backed chair behind her and a carpet at her feet instead of the endless rows of metal cots on a bare pine floor. The first week we were here, she had added extra hooks to the neck of her overalls so that she could fasten the collar high around her throat, and this propriety taken off, I had the feeling she was as content to be reading the Bible here in Vaught to those who had never heard it, as she'd been serving up soup to hungry people in the hallway of the beige. As for me, I set my heart every day more firmly on September 1st. And then, all of a sudden, it looked as though we would not have to wait even this long. The Princess Irene Brigade was rumored to be in France, moving toward Belgium. Her brigade was part of the Dutch forces that had escaped to England during the 5-day war. Now it was marching to reclaim its own. The guards were noticeably tense. Roll call was an agony. The old and the ill who were slow reaching their places were beaten mercilessly. Even the red light commando came in for discipline. These young women were ordinarily a favored group of prisoners. Prostitutes, mostly from Amsterdam, they were imprisoned not for their profession, which was extolled as a patriotic duty, but for infecting German soldiers. Ordinarily, with the male guards anyway, they had a bold, breezy manner. Now, even they had to form 2 ruler straight lines and stand hours at frozen attention. The sound of the firing squad was heard more and more often. One lunchtime, when the bell sounded to return to work, Mrs. Fleur did not appear at the bench beside me. It always took a while for my eyes to readjust to the dim factory after the bright sun outside. It was only gradually that I saw the hunk of black bread still resting at her place on the bench. There had been no husband to deliver it to. And so hanging between hope and horror, we waited out the days. Rumor was we all lived on. Rumor was all we lived on. The brigade was across the Dutch border. The brigade was destroyed. The brigade had never landed. Women who stayed away from the whispered little prayer service round a cot now crowded close, demanding signs and predictions from the Bible. On the morning of September 1st, Mrs. Floyd gave birth to a baby girl. The child lived 4 hours. Several days later, we awoke to the sound of distant explosions. Long before roll call whistle, entire barracks was up and milling about their dark between the cots. Was it bombs? Artillery fire? Surely the brigade had reached Brabant. This very day they might be in Vaught. The scowls and threats of the guards when they arrived daunted us not at all. Everyone's mind had turned homeward. Everyone talked of what she would do first. The plants will all be dead, said Betsy, but we'll get some cuttings from Nolly. We'll wash the windows so the sun can come up. At the Phillips factory, Mr. Mormon tried to calm us. Those aren't bombs, he said, and certainly not guns. That's demolition work. Germans, they're probably blowing up bridges. That means they expect an attack, but not that it's here. It might not come for weeks. This dampened us a bit, but as the blast came closer and closer, nothing could keep down hope. Now they were so near they hurt our ears. Drop your lower jaw, Mr. Mormon called down the long room. Keep your mouth open. It will save your eardrums. We had our midday meal inside with the doors and windows closed. We'd been working again for an hour, sitting on our benches. No one could do work when the order came to return to the dormitories. With sudden urgency, women embraced husbands and sweethearts who worked beside them at Phillips. Betsy was waiting for me outside the barracks. Corrie, has the brigade come? Are we free? No, not yet. I don't know. Oh, Betsy, why am I so frightened? The loudspeaker in the men's camp was sounding the signal for roll call. No order was given here, and we drifted about aimlessly, listening, we scarcely knew for what. Names were being read through the men's speaker, though it was too far away to make them out. And suddenly an intense fear gripped the waiting women. A death-like silence now hung over both sides of the vast camp. The loudspeaker had fallen silent. We exchanged wordless looks. We almost feared to breathe. Then rifle fire split the air. Around us, women began to weep. A second volley, a third. For 2 hours the executions went on. Someone counted. More than 700 male prisoners were killed that day. There was little sleeping in our barracks that night, and no roll call the following morning. About 6 a.m. we were ordered to collect our personal things. Betsy and I put our belongings into the pillowcases we had brought from Chevinine, toothbrushes, needles, and thread, a small bottle of Davitamon oil that had come in a Red Cross package, Nolly's blue sweater, which was the only thing we had brought with us when we left the quarantine camp 10 weeks before. I transferred the Bible in its bag from Betsy's back to my own. She was so thin it made a visible lump between her shoulders. We were marched to a field where soldiers were passing out blankets from the backs of open trucks. As we filed past, Betsy and I drew 2 beautiful, soft new ones. Mine was white with blue stripes, Betsy's with red stripes, obviously the property of some well-to-do family. About noon, the exodus from camp began. Through the drab streets of barracks we went, past the bunkers, through the maze of barbed wire compounds and enclosures, and at last on the rough dirt road through the woods down which we had stumbled that rainy night in June. Betsy hung hard to my arm. She was laboring for breath, as she always did when she had to walk any distance. March, Schnell, double time! I slipped my arm beneath Betsy's shoulders and half carried her the final quarter mile. At last the path ended, and we lined up facing a single track, over 1,000 women standing toe to heel. Farther along, the men's section was also at the siding. It was impossible to identify individuals among the shaved heads glistening in the autumn sun. At first I thought our train had not come. Then I realized that these freight cars standing on the tracks were for us. Already the men were being prodded aboard, clambering up over the high sides. We could not see the engine, just this row of small, high-wheeled European boxcars stretching out of sight in both directions, machine guns mounted in intervals on the top. Soldiers were approaching along the track, pausing at each car to haul open the heavy sliding door. In front of us, a gaping black interior appeared. Women began to press forward. Clutching our blankets and pillowcases, we were swept along with the others. Betsy's chest was still heavy, heaving oddly after the rapid march. I had to boost her over the side of the train. At first I could make out nothing in the dark car. Then in a corner I saw a tall, uneven shape. It was a stack of bread, dozens of flat black loaves piled one on top of another. A long trip, then. The small car was getting crowded. We were shoved back against the back wall. 30 or 40 people were all that could fit in, and still the soldiers drove women over the side, cursing, jabbing with their guns. Shrieks rose from the center of the car, but still the press increased. It was only when 80 women were packed inside the door that the door thumped shut, and we heard iron bolts driven into place. Women were sobbing, and many fainted, although the tight wedged crowd, they remained upright. Just when it seemed certain that those in the middle must suffocate or be trampled to death, we worked out a kind of system whereby, half sitting, half lying, with our legs wedged around one another like members of the sledding team, we were able to get down on the floor of the car. "Do you know what I'm thankful for?" Betsy's gentle voice startled me in that squirming madhouse. "I'm thankful that Father is in heaven today." Father. Yes, oh Father, how could I have wept for you? The warm sun beat down on the motionless train. When the temperature in that packed car rose, the air grew foul. Beside me, someone was tugging at a nail in the ancient wood of the wall. At last it came free. With the point, she set to work at gouging the hole wider. Others, around the sides, took up the idea, and in a while, blessed whiffs of outside air began to circle about us. It was hours before the train gave a sudden lurch and began to move. Almost at once, it stopped again. Then again it crawled forward. The rest of the day and into the night, it was the same, stopping, starting, slamming, jerking. Once, when it was my turn at the air hole, I saw in the moonlight trainmen carrying a length of twisted rail. Tracks ahead must be destroyed. I passed on the news. Maybe they would not be able to repair them. Maybe we'd still be in Holland when liberation came. Betsy's forehead was hot to my hand. The red light girl between whose legs I was wedged squeezed herself into an even tighter crouch so that Betsy could lie almost flat across my lap. I dozed too, from time to time my head on the shoulder of the friendly girl behind us. Once I dreamed it was storming. I could hear the hailstones on Tante John's front windows. I opened my eyes. It really was hailing. I could hear it rattling against the side of the car. Everyone was awake now and talking. Another storm of hail, and then we heard a burst of machine guns fire from the roof of the train. "It's bullets," someone shouted. "They're attacking the train." Again we heard that sound like tiny stones striking the wall, and again the machine guns answered. Had the brigade reached us at last? The firing died away. For an hour the train sat motionless, then slowly crawled forward. At dawn, someone called out that we were passing through the border town of Emmerich. We had arrived in Germany. We'll have to see where they end up in chapter 13.